there are 5 principles that I always like try to focus on. And within these principles, there's a lot of variability. But the first one is the caloric balance, right? So if we were trying to gain size, we would want to be in a positive caloric balance, right? Eating a little bit more fuel than our body needs to sustain its current mass. If we were trying to cut, we would want to be in a caloric deficit, so a little bit less than our body needs. So caloric balance is where you can just kind of maintain the weight, maintain the mass. So for me, that's right at about like 3,500 calories just to kind of stay where I'm at, given my activity and my basal metabolic rate. The more muscle mass you have, the higher your metabolic rate is going to be because muscle uses energy. So that's the first piece, is like having the caloric balance. And there's lots of formulas we use to try to calculate that, because like your biometrics make a huge difference. Age, gender, activity level, genetics, I usually give people my very best guess, and the majority of the time I get it right. But sometimes it's also, as a coach, understanding like, well, how do they react to it? So, every time when someone does a check-in with me usually on a weekly basis, the first thing I want to know is their weight differential from last week to this week. Is like, how did your weight change? Because that'll give me a good idea as to like the caloric balance. The second piece is being in a positive nitrogen balance, which means you're consuming plenty of protein to sustain your lean muscle tissue. So whether I'm trying to maintain, whether I'm trying to gain or even cut, I'm always trying to get into that positive nitrogen balance, because that's going to be supportive of not just muscle, but also muscle growth. So that's another really important one. So for me, it either looks like, low carb, high protein, high carb, high protein. Very seldomly will I go to high fat though. And the reason for that is because in terms of metabolism, fat is going to really slow down your digestion, and it's not going to be really conducive to muscle growth. So for someone in the off season, you don't want to go crazy on fat. You really just want to leverage carbohydrates and protein and try to get the most out of that. And they're generally, it doesn't mean you don't have fat. You're just not eating high amounts of it. Right. There's a context for a high fat diet, but the context isn't muscle growth, right? That's not really where it applies. It more applies to things like insulin sensitivity, general health outcomes, biomarkers. Like that can be, keto diet can be improving on biohealth markers. So with people with like metabolic disorders, that can be extremely helpful. For people with cancer, that's an anti-inflammatory, reducing. I mean, the whole reason why low carb works so well for cancer people is because it reduces all the growth factors in the body, the insulin responses, that kind of stuff. So there is a context for that. But, in terms of what we're talking about, we're usually not going to go crazy with fat. So there's a positive nitrogen balance. The next thing that most people don't consider, and I think this is where I'm remarkably different than most nutrition coaches, is that I heavily prioritize targeted nutrient timing, because this to me is exactly where you can start to break a lot of training and nutrition myths. So the big myth that's out there is that you can't gain muscle and lose body fat. That's kind of like the big thing. You can't be cutting and gaining at the same time, so to speak. And the truth is, like, that's not actually true. You can do it, but you do need to be very strategic about it. And the way you can be strategic about it is by balancing the anabolic signals, where you're trying to stimulate growth factors, like get an insulin response to help shuttle glucose into muscle cells and drive nutrients and replenish muscles and get those growth factors, and catabolic signals, where you're actually trying to reduce the size of fat cells and stimulate a hormone called glucagon that converts stored glycogen back into glucose to raise your blood sugar if you're fasted or if you're in a low carbohydrate state. So, if I'm maintaining, I'm eating carbs, but there are a couple of rules. Outside of a certain window, there are no carbs, right? So this is a way you can hold really good composition, but also be able to grow some muscle in the process. And usually that looks like placing about 3/4 of your daily carbohydrate intake in a 3-hour window before and after your training. Because if you're having it 3 hours before your training, it's going to be in your system, and you'll be very apt to use it when you start lifting or training with intensity. Your muscle's job is to just dispose of glucose. So if your glucose is high going into a workout, that's not a big deal at all. You're not going to store it, you're going to use it. And same thing post-workout. Like, you do want to get an insulin spike post-workout. But if you're spiking your blood sugar throughout the day, you're going to lose that insulin sensitivity, and you start to almost negate that effect. So you want to kind of be really strategic with how you're using carbohydrates. And that to me is like the best way. If you're trying to, like, the typical athlete is like, I want to recomp, I want to reduce my fat and gain muscle. That's kind of the really important protocol. And then the last two are training related. It's like, all of our athletes, whether they're cutting or gaining, usually have some representation of fasted cardio in the morning. And the fasted cardio serves us on a number of purposes. Like
Mhm.
one, it energizes you, it stimulates dopamine, helps reset your circadian rhythm. But more importantly, it helps maintain good insulin sensitivity and helps you shrink fat cells. Because when you haven't eaten all night and now you start doing activity, your glucose, your blood sugar is going to drop a little bit, and that's going to help stimulate glucagon. And you normally I'll have people do it like some branched
Mhm.
chain amino acids, even to amplify that effect to some degree. And if you're bulking, it might just be 10 minutes. If you're cutting, sometimes it goes up to 45 minutes or an hour. But
Yep.
usually there's always some representation of fasted cardio. And in all scenarios, there is that concept of like the heavy lifting,
Yep.
like to be able to grow and maintain lean muscle mass, to be able to like really improve your composition where you're not just eating away at muscle, you have to stimulate muscle to either maintain it or to even grow it in some
Mhm.
cases. So you have to have kind of that intense, voluminous lifting session where you're going to try to dispose of all that glucose. And then you've got this other end of the spectrum where now it's like we're really more focused on reducing the size of fat cells. And so it's a balancing act. If you were trying to go like really far on one end, the protocols just become more aggressive. So as the surplus goes up, like we have to deprioritize some of that stuff. And maybe now we're not as restrictive of carbohydrates outside that training window. Or if we're cutting very aggressively, maybe we even have to reduce the amount of carbohydrates around that lifting and push to a more aggressive deficit or increase the fasted cardio to a larger degree. So it really depends on the context.